In the scorching heat of a small Texas highway town, 32-year-old Emily Connor was about to turn a notorious outlaw gang's entire world upside down. When the fearsome Devil's Mirage roared into the dusty lot of Miller's fuel stop, they thought they'd found another easy target. What they didn't know was that Emily had served 3 tours in Iraq as a decorated combat nurse, a woman whose quiet demeanor masked fierce resolve and battlefield-tested skills. What began as a routine gas station shakedown would soon unravel one of the region's most feared biker networks, leading to a dramatic showdown that would change lives and a once sleepy community forever. The Texas sun shimmered against the cracked pavement as Emily stepped out of her pickup truck to fill the tank. Beads of sweat trickled down her brow, but her gaze stayed calm, surveying a horizon she had come to know well in her post-deployment travels. Miller's fuel stop had always been a peaceful pit stop, a relic of simpler times. Until now. The sudden roar of engines shattered the quiet. 6 bikers, clad in leather and bristling with bravado, circled like vultures ready to strike. Their leader, scarred and full of swagger, made his intentions clear: intimidation, quick cash, and total control of the situation. One glance at Emily's petite frame and unassuming stance told them they had nothing to fear. They couldn't have been more wrong. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Please tell us where you are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is mind-blowing. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty highway, its punishing rays casting a shimmering haze across the asphalt. It was one of those notorious Texas afternoons where the heat seemed to smother everyone and everything in its path. Even the breeze, when it occasionally meandered through, offered no relief, just another layer of dry, stifling air that felt more like a furnace blast than a wind. Beyond the highway stretched flat, endless fields dotted with cacti, mesquite, and the occasional tumbleweed that ambled lazily across the terrain. At the side of the road stood Miller's fuel stop, a modest gas station with a red, chipped-over time sign that read, in big white letters, Miller's. Frank Miller, the station's owner, had inherited the place from his father. A relic of another era, Miller's fuel stop hadn't changed much in the last 3 decades. The pumps were old, and the small convenience store behind them was packed with dusty shelves of sundries, motor oil, car fresheners, soda bottles, and candy bars that looked as though they'd been there as long as Frank himself. Yet, the station retained a timeless charm, something reminiscent of simpler days. Even the old payphone booth, set in a cracked concrete slab near the entrance, bore silent witness to countless travelers' stories over the years. Inside the convenience store, Frank was leaning on the counter, fanning himself with a folded newspaper. He was in his early 50s, tall but stooped, sweat staining the back of his shirt in patches. Deep lines across his forehead and around his eyes suggested a life of hard work under an unforgiving sun. With sales as slow as they usually were, he found himself turning to the same tasks repeatedly: adjust the soda display, restack the beef jerky, check the dusty condiments, just to keep himself occupied. Outside, a battered silver pickup truck pulled up to one of the pumps. The driver's side door opened, and Emily Connor stepped out. She was in her early 30s, dressed in a simple pair of cargo pants and a plain tank top. Lean and athletic, she moved with a quiet confidence. Her brown hair was pulled back into a functional ponytail, revealing sharp, intelligent eyes. Although few would guess it at first glance, Emily had served 3 tours in Iraq as a combat nurse. Her experiences in the field had hardened her resolve and taught her to stay calm in even the most chaotic situations. She lifted the pump nozzle to fill her truck's tank. Despite the scorching sun, Emily didn't look bothered. She trained and worked in heat far worse than this. In her mind, she was simply passing through, aiming to fill up her tank, grab some cold water, and get on the road again. The station was more than just a pit stop for her, though. She found a rare solace in out-of-the-way places. When she wasn't working at the local VA hospital, she often drove around rural roads, simply thinking through memories and seeking quiet. These sporadic drives helped her process lingering anxieties, images of combat, the friendships formed and lost in war zones, and the burdens of having to save lives under fire. Staring into the shimmering horizon, Emily let out a small sigh. The routine of filling up her truck felt oddly comforting. Meanwhile, inside the store, Frank cast an inquisitive glance through the window, noticing Emily's steady, relaxed posture. He appreciated anyone who treated his place with respect and minded their own business. Most folks who stopped by were travelers or truckers who wanted to refuel and leave as quickly as possible, complaining about the dusty aisles or the scarcity of fancy goods. As Emily replaced the nozzle, she heard the low rumble of motorcycles. Faint at first, the noise grew louder by the second. The reverberations against the concrete suggested several bikes, not just one or two. A moment later, a small convoy of riders appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust as they thundered down the highway. Each biker wore a black leather jacket with a bold insignia on the back, a snarling coyote skull with wings, surrounded by the words, "Devil's Mirage." Emily had no way of knowing the specifics of that group, but the menacing aura was hard to miss. The group slowed and eventually pulled into Miller's fuel stop. There were 6 of them, each dismounting in unison. The leader, a tall man with a shaved head and a jagged scar running from his left temple down his cheek, stepped forward. He removed his helmet, revealing intense, restless eyes. The sun glinted off various pieces of metal on his leather jacket, chains and studs that served no functional purpose but amplified his intimidating presence. Emily, still by her truck, kept her focus on her own business. She paid them little mind, but remained aware. Old habits from her rock died hard. It was second nature for her to quickly size up a potential threat. She did so discreetly, keeping her posture relaxed while her eyes briefly flicked over to the bikers. One of them, younger than the rest, locked eyes with her momentarily. He smirked before turning away and following the group. Unbeknownst to them, the gang was an offshoot of a larger biker outfit known for petty crimes, intimidation tactics, and occasional barroom brawls. The local rumor mill suggested they were the enforcers of a more organized network. People called them the Outlaws, but officially they used the name Devil's Mirage. It wasn't the first time a group like that had wandered through. Yet something about this particular band felt tense, as though they were on edge, itching to pick a fight or prove their mettle. One of the bikers called out to Emily as he walked by. It was a half-hearted whistle, accompanied by a leering grin. Emily didn't respond. She simply set the pump back on its cradle, unscrewed the cap to check her oil level, a small diversionary tactic that allowed her to maintain some distance without openly confronting them. The biker lingered a second longer, shrugged, and sauntered over to the others. Within the store, Frank sighed. He could see trouble looming. This group radiated a particular brand of hostility. Standing upright, he wiped his brow with a rag, straightened his shoulders, and tried to mentally prepare himself for confrontation. He wasn't a fighter, and he didn't want trouble. But trouble often came uninvited, especially on a deserted stretch of highway like this. Emily, now finished with her oil check, allowed herself a quick glance over her shoulder. She noted how the bikers formed a loose semicircle near the station entrance, as though they were waiting to be approached, daring someone to ask questions. With a slight frown, she closed her truck's hood and decided to go inside to pay, hoping she could simply complete her transaction and drive away without complication. As she approached the door, she heard the leader of the group call out, "Hey, sweetheart, where do you think you're going so fast?" The words dripped with derision. Emily paused, then took a breath and continued walking. She ignored the comment, her focus on the glass door that led into the store. Inside, the air conditioning greeted her like an old friend. Frank was behind the counter, obviously unsettled. Emily pulled out a few bills to pay for her gas, and Frank rung her up. Over the faint hum of the AC, they exchanged a tense glance. Emily's calm demeanor assured Frank that she wasn't rattled by the bikers outside. Still, the gravity of the situation was unavoidable. Just as she was about to sign the receipt, the door jingled aggressively, and the tall, scar-faced biker entered. His heavy boots thudded on the worn linoleum floor, followed by two of his companions. The rest remained outside, leaning on their motorcycles, scanning the parking lot for potential prey. Emily stood upright, making it clear she wasn't intimidated. The biker leader nodded at Frank in a manner that was anything but friendly. "You own this place?" he asked, his voice gravelly. Frank swallowed hard. "Why?" "Name's Frank Miller." The biker didn't introduce himself. Instead, he looked around the store, sizing up the dusty shelves. "Quiet little joint you got here, Miller. But not a lot of folks come round. Must get lonely." Frank tried to keep his voice steady. "We get by." The biker's lips twisted into a sneer. "That right? Well, maybe you can help us out." Outside, the remaining bikers began revving their engines, causing an irritating racket that broke the eerie stillness. Emily looked at Frank, then at the biker leader. She could almost feel the tension in the air crackle, like static electricity. This was exactly the kind of scenario she'd faced countless times in far-off war zones. Confrontations where a few small actions might diffuse or inflame an already volatile situation. Yet here she was, back in her home state, a bystander in a small-town gas station with no intention of becoming anyone's hero. But trouble had a way of finding her, and as she recognized the gravity of what was happening, a quiet resolve formed inside her. She wouldn't let these men bully Frank or anyone else. Her experiences in combat had taught her that sometimes simply standing firm and calm could turn the tide. The biker stepped closer to the counter, and Emily could sense he was testing boundaries. Frank seemed frozen, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. The sun beat down through the store's windows, illuminating dust motes in the air and highlighting the perspiration on everyone's faces. Emily kept her eyes on the biker. She was prepared to speak if necessary, but for now she bided her time, calculating. For a moment, she wondered if she should just slip out quietly. Yet she knew that if she did nothing and these men decided to unleash chaos, innocent people would get hurt. Frank, travelers stopping by, maybe even the next person who walked in unsuspectingly. She took one step toward the biker, voice steady but polite. "Is there a problem?" He turned his gaze from Frank to Emily. The small smirk remained on his lips, revealing a glint of gold on one of his teeth. "Problem? Not sure yet. That depends on how cooperative folks around here choose to be." Emily's heart pounded, but her outward expression remained placid. She could practically smell the danger in the air, thick as the heat outside. Then, with a dismissive shrug, the biker reached over and grabbed a candy bar off the shelf, unwrapping it slowly. He took a bite and threw the wrapper on the floor. "We might need some more than just a sweet treat," he said, looking pointedly at Frank. "A little donation if you catch my drift. Maybe for gas money, or for keeping your windows intact." Emily felt the surge of adrenaline. This was not a random stop. It was a shakedown. She also knew that if they got what they wanted easily, they might grow bolder and more dangerous. Any sign of weakness now would invite future harassment, not just for Frank, but for everyone in the vicinity. That was the type of intimidation strategy she'd seen used over and over in war-torn regions. Bullies sought easy prey. Frank finally found his voice. "I don't want no trouble. Just tell me how much you need." That's when the biker leader turned and locked eyes with Emily once again. There was a spark of cruel curiosity in his gaze. He probably wondered why she stood so composed, not cowering or pleading. Instead, she radiated a sort of understated authority. For a fleeting second, a question flickered in his eyes. Who is this woman, and why isn't she afraid? Emily, resisting the urge to confront him directly, simply said, "Frank, maybe you should wait and see exactly what they want first." A flicker of annoyance crossed the leader's face. "I don't recall asking you anything, sweetheart." Tension built, thick as the desert dust outside. A hush fell over the store, interrupted only by the hum of the AC and the distant rumble of the other motorcycles revving. For a heartbeat, everyone seemed suspended in a moment of uncertain possibility. Would the confrontation break out into open violence right then and there? The air was electric. Emily recognized that if she didn't intervene carefully, matters could escalate rapidly. Yet she also sensed something in the biker's eyes, a mix of arrogance and bravado tempered by curiosity. Perhaps reason could still prevail if approached the right way. Outside, one of the bikers let out a loud holler, impatient for trouble or score or both. Emily squared her shoulders. She'd been here before, in hot, tense situations where the slightest wrong move could lead to a deadly outcome. But this was Texas, not Iraq. And these were bullies, not enemy combatants. Even so, a bully with a weapon can be as dangerous as any insurgent. She glanced at Frank, who seemed on the verge of handing over whatever money he had in the till. Handing it over might appease them today, but tomorrow or next week, the station could face more demands, or the outlaws might return for a bigger score. Emily refused to let that cycle begin if she could help it. The leader took another step forward, leaning his weight onto the countertop. His chain rattled, and the tarnished silver glimmered under the fluorescent lights. He gave Emily a pointed look. "You mind your own business, lady," he warned. Emily's jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. "This is my business. You're threatening Frank, and I happen to be standing here." The biker let out a short, humorless laugh. Well, looks like we got ourselves a hero." The tension was unbearable, like a coiled spring about to snap. 1,000 thoughts flashed through Emily's mind. Angles of approach, potential weapons, the positions of the other bikers, and exit strategy. She'd been trained to assess threats systematically. Even her time as a nurse in combat had made her hyper-aware of personal safety and the environment around her. But there was also an unspoken moral imperative, standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves. Frank reached under the counter. Emily hoped he wasn't about to do anything rash, like grab a shotgun or a pistol. That would escalate matters dangerously. Sometimes brandishing a gun could scare thugs off, but often it triggered a violent standoff. The outlaws didn't look like they'd flinch at the sight of a weapon. They came ready for trouble, and no telling what they were packing. Then, abruptly, the biker leader cocked his head as if listening for something. Outside, a car pulled in, the driver apparently oblivious to what was happening inside. Another potential victim, or perhaps an unwitting witness. Whatever the case, the biker leader snorted, turned, and signaled for his men. "We'll handle this outside. Miller, think on how much you value that old truck stop, yeah?" His parting words hung in the air, raw intimidation. Emily expected them to leave, but one of the other bikers lingered by the door. He gave Emily a once-over, a gaze filled with silent contempt, then followed his leader out. For a brief moment, Emily and Frank just stood there, listening to the fading footsteps, the roar of the motorcycles revving outside, and the relentless hum of the air conditioner. Emily's shoulders gradually relaxed, but her mind remained on high alert. The threat hadn't dissolved. It had merely stepped outside. Frank exhaled a long, shaky breath. "I'm sorry you got caught up in this. You might want to leave before they do something stupid." Emily met his eyes. "I can't just walk away, Frank. They'll only come back." Frank's hand trembled slightly, and he set it on the counter to steady himself. Outside, the motorcycles kept roaring, a testament to the biker's desire to intimidate. Emily's thoughts raced. She had no intention of starting a firefight, but she knew the situation required a firm stance or cunning. Letting them roll over everyone would solve nothing. Before Frank could respond, the roar of the bikes increased, accompanied by mocking shouts. Emily's heart rate kicked into a higher gear. She tightened her ponytail and glanced at Frank, who had the look of someone torn between fear and gratitude. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words. Emily steeled herself, stepping toward the door. Was she truly prepared to intervene? She had served in war zones, but this was home turf. These were criminals bent on exerting power and fear. They knew little about her. They assumed she was just another woman passing through, helpless against their might. The question was, how much would she reveal of her own capabilities? How far would she go if it came down to a physical confrontation? Emily tried to weigh her options quickly, mindful of a single truth she'd learned while under fire in Iraq. It's sometimes less about what you do and more about how confidently you do it. She pushed open the door, the blast of midday heat hitting her like a wall. There, under the blazing sun, 6 men waited, mocking, smirking, and rolling their shoulders as if preparing for a brawl. She sensed the hostility, but also something else, a flicker of hesitation. Perhaps they hadn't expected her to come out so boldly. At that moment, she recalled the mantra that had carried her through countless high-stakes situations overseas. Stay calm, stay focused, and do what you must. As the door clicked shut behind her, Emily knew there was no going back. Yet the question remained, how far would these outlaws push her, and what toll would it take on everyone involved? The scorching sun bore down as Emily stepped into the open, face to face with the gang. They loomed around her like circling hawks, and Frank watched from inside, fear twisting his features. Everything hinged on the next moments, where one misstep could set off a chain reaction of violence. Emily stood firm, steadying her breath. Would she be forced to unleash the part of herself she'd hoped to leave in the past? Emily's vision momentarily blurred as the sun hammered her eyes, then adjusted. The bikers were close, forming a horseshoe formation around her truck and the store's entrance. Their rides, a mix of Harley-Davidsons and custom choppers, hissed gently in the heat. The surrounding landscape offered little solace, just cracked earth and a loneliness that seemed to resonate with tension. Stepping forward, Emily saw the leader, the man with the scar, assessing her. His posture was that of someone used to commanding respect through fear. He smirked, but there was a flicker of caution in his eyes. Had he pegged her for someone with training, or was he simply reading the fearlessness in her stance? Before anyone could speak, Emily flashed back to a time when she'd faced life-threatening situations in the medical tents of Iraq. Wounded soldiers, mortar shells landing too close, the adrenaline rush that heightened her senses. As a combat nurse, she'd become adept at controlling her emotions, focusing on triage and making life-saving decisions under fire. Now she felt a similar adrenaline surge, but was tempered by the knowledge that direct violence might not be the only way out. She let the tension hang, refusing to show intimidation. The leader finally broke the silence. "You're mighty brave, stepping out here alone." His voice carried the rough drawl of someone who'd spent many nights in seedy bars and on the open road. "I've seen worse than you," she replied calmly, not bragging, merely stating a fact. The dryness in her tone hinted at her experience, a subdued authority that perplexed him. One of the other bikers, the younger one who had smirked at her earlier, barked out a laugh. I like her. Got some fire." Emily ignored him, keeping her attention on the leader. She observed his slight shift in weight, the subtle narrowing of his eyes. Threat detection, a skill she'd honed over several tours, kicked in automatically. He was armed, most likely with a concealed weapon, though she hadn't spotted a gun in his waistband yet. Maybe a knife or a sidearm hidden in his jacket. The others could be carrying anything, pistols, knives, or just heavy chains. "Frank told me you were looking for a donation," Emily said, crossing her arms. "How much are you after?" The leader's eyebrows rose, slightly amused. "Straight to business, huh?" He gestured to his men. We don't have a fixed amount. We just appreciate generosity and respect." Emily nodded thoughtfully, feigning compliance. "Respect goes both ways." He arched an eyebrow. "Does it now?" "That's right." His eyes flickered with a challenge. "You a cop?" Emily shook her head. "No, just someone who doesn't like bullies." Her words hung in the air, and the group stiffened. Bullies, she had named them exactly that. A nerve struck. The younger biker laughed again, but it sounded forced. One with a wiry beard and a bandana scowled. The leader's lips pressed into a thin line, and he seemed to weigh his next move. "You don't even know who we are," he said after a moment. "You're the devil's Mirage, or so your jackets say," she replied, nodding to their patches. And I know you're threatening a man who's done nothing but try to run his business peacefully." He scoffed, adjusting a chain on his sleeve. "We've got a reputation for being more than a name on a patch, lady." Emily fought the urge to let sarcasm slip into her voice. "I'm sure you do. Doesn't mean I have to bow down." A hush fell over the lot. One of the bikers pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and took a drag, exhaling a swirl of smoke that faded into the desert air. The younger one, evidently the sidekick, cracked his knuckles. Emily felt a tingling sense of anticipation, like walking a razor's edge. She'd navigated volatile negotiations in the midst of gunfire, but this was different. She had no backup, no commanding officer. She was on her own. Meanwhile, inside the convenience store, Frank hovered by the window, occasionally peeking through the dusty glass. His expression was a mix of fear and awe. He couldn't hear every word, but he saw the stances, the body language. He knew Emily was taking a stand on his behalf, an extraordinary move he never expected from a random traveler. "Let's cut to the chase," the leader said, hooking his thumbs in his belt loops. "We want some cash. Not your truck, not your life, just a little something to make it worthwhile for us to move on." "What about the next place you visit?" Emily asked. "What do you demand then?" He shrugged. "That's none of your concern. It is if you keep up this habit. People get hurt eventually, or worse." The leader turned away, kicking a small rock with his boot. It skittered across the concrete. His voice took on a condescending lilt. "Listen, darling, you're tough, I'll give you that. But in the real world, you're either given orders or talking them. Right now, you're about to find out which side you're on." Emily's pulse quickened, but she kept her face unreadable. "I was giving orders when you were still learning to ride. You don't scare me." That line hung there, a deliberate jab. The younger biker stepped forward aggressively. "Who do you think you are, talking to our boss like that?" "She thinks she's somebody," the bearded one muttered. The leader raised a hand, silencing them. Then he looked at Emily with renewed interest. The smirk returned, tinged with curiosity. "All right, I'll buy it. Where does this confidence come from? You ex-military? Some sort of martial arts champion?" Emily didn't flinch. "I was a combat nurse. Iraq. 3 tours." The leader's expression changed fractionally. Some measure of respect flickered in his eyes, but it was short-lived. "That explains the attitude. But nurses fix people up, right? You don't do the fighting." Emily allowed a small, controlled smile. "Some of us know how to handle a weapon, treat a wound, and keep our heads in a crisis. We do what's necessary." The tension ratcheted even higher. Emily could sense a fragile balance. The bikers might either call her bluff or reconsider messing with someone who obviously wouldn't cower. Yet, bullies rarely back down easily. They test and probe until they're certain they can't win. The younger biker sneered. "Sounds like she's telling war stories. We've had our share of fights too. Ain't that right, boss?" The leader shrugged, turning his gaze toward the horizon for a moment. His face clouded with an internal calculation, as if deciding whether to escalate or pivot. Finally, he looked at Emily. "You think you can handle us if we decide to do more than talk?" "If you push me, I'll do whatever it takes," she said. Her tone was calm, revealing neither bravado nor fear. It was simply the truth. A tremor of unease passed through the group. Most of them had encountered armed shopkeepers, angry truckers, or even the occasional vigilante who brandished a gun. But rarely did they face someone with genuine combat experience who didn't blink in the face of danger. The difference was palpable. Still, the leader forced a laugh. "A combat nurse? That's a new one. We'll see how you patch yourself up when we're done." He took a step forward, but before he could continue, a truck rumbled into the parking lot. A family of 4, the father at the wheel, mother on the passenger side, and 2 children in the back, slowed to a stop at a pump on the far side of the station. The father gave a cursory glance toward the motorcycles, but seemed unaware of the tension. Emily realized the outlaws might use that family as leverage, or at least intimidate them. She couldn't let that happen. As she shifted her stance subtly, the leader noticed her concern. He followed her gaze, locking onto the unsuspecting family. His grin widened, revealing the gold tooth. Well now, we got ourselves an audience. Emily's mind raced. If these men decided to make an example of someone, that family would be easy prey. She had to keep the biker's attention on her. "I'll make you a deal," she said quickly. "You want cash? Here." She pulled out her wallet and handed over several bills, more than enough for a tank of gas. "Take it and leave them alone. Then move on." The leader took the money, eyeing it with disappointment. "Only a few hundred. Not exactly a jackpot. You're a nurse. You must have more than that saved up. Maybe in the bank." She shook her head. "That's all I have on me." He flipped through the bills. "Huh? It's a start." Another biker piped up. "What about the station's till? That old man's got money inside, I'm sure." Emily set her jaw. "Frank's told you he'll pay. Let him do it on his terms, but let these people gas up and go in peace." The younger biker rolled his eyes. "Getting real tired of her act, boss." The leader rubbed his scarred cheek thoughtfully. "Let's say we accept your little donation. Then what's in it for us? You keep your freedom. Nobody calls the cops. Everyone walks away. Are you threatening to call the police?" One of the others snapped. Emily maintained eye contact with the leader. "I don't need to threaten you. The father in that truck might, or it's the next person who passes by. Sooner or later, you'll run out of luck." A low growl resonated among the group. They hated being cornered logically. The possibility of reinforcements, like a local sheriff's deputy, was real. The leader spat on the ground. He looked at the bills in his hand, then glanced over at Emily's truck. Nice truck. Keys in the ignition. Her heart clenched, but she kept her cool. "Don't even think about it." He snorted. "Easy, nurse. I was just curious." The father at the other pump finished fueling, eyes darting nervously at the motorcycles. The mother motioned for the kids to stay inside. Emily could see the father's tension, his knuckles white as he gripped the gas nozzle. He was probably praying they could drive away without incident. In the midst of it all, Emily's memory flashed to nights in Iraq, hearing the distant pop-pop-pop of gunfire, the whir of helicopter blades overhead, and the swirl of dust so thick it caked her eyelashes. She remembered how decisive action in critical moments often determined who lived and who didn't. Now the stakes felt equally critical, even though she was far from the battlefield. One wrong move, and there could be bloodshed. The leader pocketed Emily's money, then drummed his fingers on his thigh. "We're wasting daylight," he announced to his men. "I say we take what we can, teach these folks a little lesson in fear, and move on." Emily squared her shoulders. "And what lesson is that?" He gave her a twisted grin. "That we don't like meddlers." The tension snapped as the leader lunged forward with surprising speed, attempting to grab Emily by the arm. She twisted out of his reach, her reflexes honed by combat training. He stumbled a step, clearly caught off guard by her agility. Two of the other bikers advanced. Emily moved in a controlled retreat, not wanting to be surrounded. Her eyes flicked around, noting distances, angles, improvised weapons. A part of her wanted to avoid a physical clash, but the outlaws seemed bent on intimidation, and possibly more. From inside the store, Frank's face was pressed against the window, armed. In the other vehicle, the father looked like he was weighing whether to intervene or flee. His children's safety likely took precedence over everything else. Emily realized she had to neutralize this threat quickly, or the entire situation could spiral out of control. The younger biker faked a lunge, trying to rattle her. Emily stood her ground. She shifted her weight onto her back foot, preparing. The leader noticed the stance, eyes narrowing, and signaled for the others to surround her. This time, He reached for something inside his leather jacket. Emily's pulse hammered as she spotted the glint of metal in the leader's grasp. She was outnumbered, but not outwitted. In a split second, she had to decide, escalate or outmaneuver. Would she be forced to fight for her life right here in the middle of a dusty Texas gas station parking lot, with innocent bystanders looking on? The leader's hand emerged from his jacket, clutching a switchblade with a worn ebony handle. He flicked it open, the sharp metallic click piercing the heavy silence. Dust swirled around them, the midday sun beating down on Emily's shoulders. Her heart thumped, but she kept her expression controlled. He smirked, brandishing the blade in a way that suggested he'd done so many times before. "Not so tough now, are ya?" he taunted, inching closer. The blade caught a glint of sunlight, a small lethal star in the desert glare. Emily shifted her stance again, mentally cataloging possibilities. She had no weapon, nothing visible at least. She considered the environment for improvised defenses. Perhaps the gas nozzle, a tire iron in the back of her truck, or even the station's old broom leaning near the door. But she also wondered if she could talk them down. The younger biker moved to her right, while the bearded one circled to her left. The other three hovered near the motorcycles, engines rumbling, waiting to see if they needed to get involved. They seemed confident that 3 men with a knife would easily subdue 1 woman. Emily exhaled slowly, forcibly calming her nerves. Adrenaline was a double-edged sword, useful, but potentially overwhelming. During her tours, Emily had undergone survival and defense training specifically designed for combat medics. She was taught that when cornered, the best strategy was to remain unpredictable, seize the advantage quickly, and commit to action with absolute decisiveness. Her instructors always emphasized that hesitation meant danger. The leader twirled the knife once, then lunged, aiming a slash at her midsection. Emily pivoted sideways, letting the blade slice only air. Immediately, she grabbed his wrist, using his momentum against him. With a swift upward twist, honed from countless hours practicing wrist lock techniques, she forced him to drop the knife. He gasped in pain, surprise etched across his face. Before she could fully disarm him, the younger biker dove in, swinging a fist at her. She ducked, releasing the leader's arm. The younger biker's punch sailed past, missing her. She then snapped her elbow back into his ribs, forcing a grunt out of him. The leader, now freed, clutched his wrist, scowling in pain and anger. The bearded man moved in, attempting to grab her from behind. Emily sidestepped, hooking his leg with her own. He stumbled, and she used his forward motion to shove him to the ground. The entire clash lasted a few heart-pounding seconds. The other bikers near the motorcycles revved their engines in agitation, torn between jumping into the fight and guarding their bikes. Frank, watching through the window, looked stunned. He'd never seen anyone move that fast, let alone a woman who appeared so unassuming. Sucking in a breath, Emily glared at the men. "Walk away," she ordered, voice low. She wanted to end this without anyone getting seriously hurt, but she wasn't naive. These men had pride, and they'd just been humiliated, briefly but decisively. "Get her," the leader snarled, ignoring her warning. The younger biker, clutching his ribs, lunged again, this time brandishing a chain that had been looped through his belt. He swung it in a wide arc, aiming for Emily's head. She ducked, backing up quickly. The chain whistled through the air, just missing her. The momentum nearly spun the biker off balance. The leader recovered enough to pick up his dropped knife. Now Emily was dealing with 2 weapons. She spared a half-second glance behind her to ensure the father, mother, and kids were keeping their distance. The father was crouched by his car door, possibly ready to intervene. But one look at the chain and knife likely convinced him to protect his family instead. As the chain came at her again, Emily darted to the side, letting the metal links clang against the concrete. She spotted an opportunity, an old tire iron on the ground near the station's metal garbage can. She dove for it, rolling across her shoulder, then sprang up with the iron gripped in her hands. The chain-wielding biker cursed as he missed her again. Now armed, Emily steadied herself. "This ends now," she called out, attempting once more to break through their machismo. The men hesitated briefly, uncertain if they wanted to keep tangling with someone who'd already shown she could handle herself. Just then, the bearded biker scrambled up from the ground and charged her like a bull. Emily sidestepped, swinging the tire iron low, tapping his shin just enough to unbalance him. He stumbled, cursing. She didn't want to smash his leg outright. Her training taught her to disable rather than injure unnecessarily, but she needed them to understand they were outmatched. A ragged cheer rose from the other bikers near the pumps. They found the spectacle thrilling, even if the tide wasn't in their favor. They'd come expecting to shake down a sleepy gas station, not engage in a life-and-death brawl with a trained professional. The leader locked eyes with Emily again, his scowl intensifying. He clearly hated looking weak in front of his crew. As if on cue, he lunged at her with a knife and a deceptively quick jab. She deflected with a tire iron, twisting her body to avoid the blade. Metal clashed in the sweltering air, and a spark flew. The impact jarred Emily's arms, but she maintained her grip, forcing the knife aside. The chain wielder seized the moment to lash out again, but Emily dropped low, the chain slicing the empty space above her. With a fierce upward movement, she slammed the tire iron against his wrist. He cried out, dropping the chain and cradling his arm. Before she could deliver a finishing blow, the bearded biker tried to tackle her from behind. She half-turned, catching him with her elbow, her form echoing countless hours of close-quarters combat practice. Frank watched in wide-eyed fascination. He had no idea Emily possessed these skills. Moments ago, she had been just another customer. Now she was a whirlwind of calculated strikes and evasive maneuvers, systematically disarming each outlaw who challenged her. The leader, realizing brute force was failing, stepped back a pace. Blood trickled from a small cut on his temple, possibly inflicted when Emily deflected his knife. His breathing was ragged, but his eyes burned with defiance. He glared at Emily, chest heaving. "You're making a big mistake," he growled, his voice laced with fury. "When my people hear about this..." Emily wiped sweat from her brow. "Keep talking or walk away. Your call." The younger biker, possibly emboldened by his leader's threat, snarled, "Finish her off, boss." But the leader hesitated. Despite his pride, he recognized Emily wasn't the easy target he pegged her to be, and they lost the element of surprise. One of the other bikers yelled from behind, "Let's get the hell out of here, man. This is talking too long." Another revved his engine, glancing nervously at the road. The threat of passing law enforcement still loomed. A gang assault was more serious than a simple shakedown. The leader cast a glance at his men. They were battered, humiliated, and not eager for more. He spat on the ground. "This ain't over," he hissed at Emily, brandishing his blade in a threatening gesture but not advancing further. Emily held her stance. "It is if you leave now." Seething, the leader motioned for his crew to back off. They gathered near their motorcycles, some holding bruised limbs, others wearing anger like a second skin. The younger biker glared daggers at Emily, but he said nothing. In their eyes, this was a postponement, not a defeat. Before straddling his bike, the leader leveled a final threat. "You'll regret crossing us." He flipped the knife closed with a snap. "Believe that." Emily stood her ground, breathing heavily but in control. "If I see you around here again, I'll assume you came looking for trouble." His lip curled in disdain. Then he fired up his Harley, the engine growling. The other bikers followed suit, turning their motorcycles back onto the highway. Dust clouded around their tires as they roared away, leaving only the echo of their engines behind. Silence enveloped the gas station. Emily lowered the tire iron, her arm muscles trembling from tension and adrenaline. The father on the far side of the lot exhaled visibly, quickly ushering his family back into their car. Frank, wide-eyed and pale, burst out of the store, nearly tripping over the threshold in his rush. "Are you okay?" he asked breathlessly, looking Emily over for injuries. She nodded, still catching her breath. "I'm fine. Just a little winded." In truth, her heart was pounding against her ribcage and sweat drenched her shirt. But physically, she was unharmed aside from a few bruises. Frank gazed in the direction where the bikers had disappeared. "Thank God you were here. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." His eyes brimmed with relief, gratitude, and residual fear. Emily offered a faint smile. "I just did what needed to be done." At that moment, the father of the family approached cautiously, holding his cap in one hand. His wife and children watched from the car. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I don't know how to thank you. We were terrified." She shook her head. "You don't need to thank me. I just hope they don't bother you on the road." The man nodded fervently. "We'll take the next exit and head straight to the sheriff. Let them know what happened." He gave Emily a once-over. "Are you sure you're all right?" "Yeah," she replied. "I'm just fine." With that, the family hurried into their truck and left, presumably seeking safer territory. Emily slowly handed the tire iron back to Frank, who accepted it with a shaky hand. They both glanced at the road again, half expecting the bikers to come roaring back. Frank let out a long breath. "I'm sorry you got dragged into this. Let me pay for your gas. It's the least I can do." "It's okay," Emily said. "You don't have to." He insisted, pressing a wad of bills into her hand. "Please, you saved my station. You saved me. I might not have a lot, but I'm not letting you pay for your gas after what you just did." Emily hesitated, then relented, touched by his gratitude. She slipped the money into her pocket. Her limbs felt heavy, and she allowed herself a moment of silent reflection. The confrontation had been swift and intense, reminding her too much of the life-or-death struggles she'd faced abroad. Frank fidgeted. "You think they'll come back?" Emily's gaze lingered on the stretch of highway. "They might, but not immediately. Their pride's wounded, but they're also scared of the law." She looked at Frank with a seriousness that made him stand straighter. "You should call the sheriff, file a report, and maybe get some extra security measures here. Cameras, if nothing else." Frank nodded, swallowing hard. "I will." The scorching sun seemed less oppressive in the wake of the fight, as if the burst of violence had momentarily taken precedence over the climate. Emily's stomach churned with residual adrenaline. She recognized the signs, the racing thoughts, the jittery limbs, the dryness in her mouth. She'd have to manage that, just as she did after every high-stress situation in the combat zone. Frank motioned toward the station. "Come inside, please. Let me at least get you some water. I have a first aid kit if you need it." Emily glanced at the entrance, then back at the empty highway. "All right," she agreed. "Just for a minute." They walked in silence toward the door, which hung slightly askew from the earlier commotion. Emily could see the marks on the dusty floor where the bikers had stomped in, their anger leaving a residual imprint on the place. Inside, the store's lights seemed too bright, the AC too cold on her damp skin. She leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly. Frank disappeared for a moment, returning with a bottle of cold water. Emily uncapped it and took a long drink, grateful for the relief it provided her parched throat. He then placed a small first aid kit beside her. She shook her head, indicating she didn't need anything beyond hydration. Frank looked visibly relieved, as if seeing her uninjured validated the entire ordeal. A cloud of unease settled over them. They'd averted a crisis, but the sense of foreboding remained. Even if the bikers didn't come back today, there was no telling what they might do in the future. Emily recognized that the group could cause chaos wherever they went. They were dangerous and unpredictable, especially with their pride hurt. She set the water down. "Frank, you really should call the sheriff right now. Let him know what happened. I'll stick around if you need me to file a statement." Frank nodded vigorously and headed to the phone on the counter. As he lifted the receiver, Emily took another sip of water, letting the tension ease from her shoulders. She had intervened, done what she deemed right, but a weight pressed on her mind. The confrontation had reawakened memories she preferred to keep buried. As Emily listened to Frank's trembling voice on the phone with the sheriff, her own pulse began to calm. But nagging doubt crept in. Had she really seen the last of the devil's Mirage? Or was this just the beginning of a larger storm gathering on the horizon? The sun beat down relentless, as if foreshadowing more trouble to come. While Frank spoke to the sheriff, Emily stepped away from the counter, letting him have some privacy. She paced slowly along the store aisles, which were stacked with chips, candy, and a few dusty souvenirs, cheap postcards of tumbleweeds and lonely highways. The hum of the fluorescent lights felt oddly soothing. She glanced at the soda fountain, then the battered old cooler holding beverages that rattled every few minutes. As she walked, her mind drifted. Memories of Iraq swirled to the surface, the makeshift infirmary in a dusty tent, the sterile smell of gauze, the sight of injured soldiers being flown in on Chinook helicopters, the swirling chaos, the sound of gunfire in the distance, the constant vigilance needed to stay alive. Combat nurses did more than just patch wounds. They often had to secure perimeters, calm terrified young recruits, and sometimes engage hostile forces in desperate moments. This confrontation with the Devil's Mirage felt like a microcosm of that life. Improvised defenses, adrenaline-fueled action, the protective instinct that refused to let intimidation go unchecked. Part of her was proud she still had the skill set to handle such a threat. Another part of her felt the old burden of post-combat exhaustion creeping in. Frank's voice rose for a moment, then quieted as he continued recounting the events to the sheriff. Emily caught fragments of his explanation. Bikers, threatened. Nurse stepped in. She grabbed a pack of tissues off a shelf, dabbing the sweat from her face and neck. She noticed she'd nicked her arm at some point, a small graze from something sharp. The cut was superficial, but it stung when she wiped sweat away. She was about to find a bandage in the first aid kit when Frank approached, handing her the phone. "Sheriff says he wants to hear from you directly." Emily took the receiver, pressing it to her ear. "Hello, Sheriff. This is Emily Connor." A gruff, authoritative voice responded. "Miss Connor, I hear you handled a situation out there. Frank's told me quite a story. You say these were the Devil's Mirage boys?" "That's right," Emily replied, her tone firm. "About 6 of them. Armed with knives, chains. They came looking for money, made threats, got physical." The sheriff let out a frustrated sigh. "We've been getting calls about those troublemakers for weeks. They move around, rarely stay in one town long enough for us to pin them down. So you got them to leave." She nodded to herself. "Yes, they left, but not happily. Well, if they come back, we'll have a unit stationed around. We're a small department, but we'll do what we can. I'd like you to come by the station to give a formal statement at some point." Emily agreed. They exchanged some details, where the department was located, the best time to drop in, and the likelihood of the outlaws returning. The sheriff also wanted a description of each biker. Emily rattled off the basics: the leader's scar, the younger one with the chain, the older one with the beard. She was precise, courtesy of her trained observational skills. After the call, she handed the phone back to Frank. His relief was palpable. He wiped his forehead with a cloth, tension visibly leaving his body. "I owe you a debt I can't repay, Emily," he said, voice trembling slightly. "Really, I'm stunned." She attempted a reassuring smile. "It's all right. I'm just glad no one was seriously hurt." He cast a glance around the store, as if noticing for the first time that nothing was broken. Then he looked at her. "You mentioned you were in the military. A nurse, specifically." She nodded. "Yes, I served several tours in Iraq." Frank shook his head in admiration. "I guess that explains a lot. I'm just thankful it was you who came by this afternoon. Otherwise, I might not be standing here in one piece." Emily waved off his praise. "I did what anyone trained for that situation would do. But, Frank, if I were you, I'd see if the sheriff can post a deputy here periodically. Those bikers might want revenge. Frank swallowed hard. Yes, of course. I'll do that. And maybe install some cameras too. Not that I have the budget for high-tech security, but I'll figure something out. A pause stretched between them. Emily realized she needed to continue her journey. She'd only planned to stop for gas after all. But she felt uneasy leaving Frank so soon, with the possibility of the gang returning. She checked her watch. It was nearing late afternoon, the sun beginning its slow descent in the sky, though the heat remained unrelenting. I can stay a bit longer if you want, she offered. Just until you close up or until someone from the sheriff's department arrives. Frank considered it, rubbing his chin in thought. That'd make me feel safer, sure. But I can't ask you to put your life on hold for me. Emily looked around the deserted lot. I've got no urgent appointments, and I won't feel right leaving you here alone until I know someone has your back. He gave her a grateful nod. I appreciate that, Emily. They settled into a companionable silence as the adrenaline faded. The overhead lights flickered, casting a dingy glow. Emily rummaged through the first aid kit, found a small adhesive bandage, and placed it over the graze on her arm. She was no stranger to patching herself up. In Iraq, she'd performed field stitches on her own thigh after catching shrapnel. A small cut was nothing in comparison. To distract themselves from the heaviness of the day, Frank and Emily began to talk. Their conversation flowed from mundane topics, whether the cost of running a remote gas station to more personal recollections of life experiences. Frank shared stories of how his father had built Miller's fuel stop in the early 70s and how, back then, the place was a bustling rest stop for cross-country travelers. Over time, bigger highway systems diverted traffic away, leaving the station reliant on locals and the occasional lost tourist. Emily found it comforting to listen to hear about someone else's simpler life. It took her mind off the hardened memories that still whispered in the back of her mind. She told Frank about her love for the open road, how she often drove through rural areas to clear her head. She avoided mentioning the nightmares that sometimes woke her in the middle of the night, or the fear that she was forever changed by what she'd witnessed in combat. She kept those burdens to herself. As dusk approached, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in purples and oranges. The oppressive heat finally relented a bit. Miller's fuel stop took on a new ambience in the twilight, softer, a bit lonely, yet oddly peaceful. Frank went to lock the main door, intending to close early. But a flicker of headlights on the highway caught their attention. A single motorcycle pulled into view, an engine roaring against the evening's stillness. Emily's pulse quickened. The bike didn't look like one of the Devil's Mirage gangs. The rider wore a different style of jacket, and the paint job was a gleaming green rather than their preferred black. But the silhouette of a lone biker was enough to make both Frank and Emily tense. The motorcycle slowed and came to a stop near the pumps. The rider removed their helmet, revealing a woman with short-cropped hair and a cautious gaze. She glanced around, noticing the emptiness of the station. "Station closed," she called out, her voice echoing across the lot. Frank relaxed marginally, stepping forward. "Not just yet. You need gas?" "Yes," she replied, dismounting. She appeared to be in her late 30s, sporting a patch on her jacket that read Veteran Riders with an American flag. "I've been on the road all day." Emily stepped out, meeting the woman halfway. There was a moment of silent recognition, one veteran to another. The patch said it all. Emily pointed to the pumps. "Feel free." The woman's gaze flicked around, sensing an undercurrent of tension. She noticed Emily's bandaged arm, the faint scuff marks on the concrete, and the lingering residue of adrenaline in the atmosphere. "Everything all right here?" she asked softly, eyebrows knitting in concern. Emily managed a smile. "We had some trouble earlier. Seems to have cleared up." The biker woman nodded slowly, as though acknowledging that trouble was commonplace in certain stretches of Texas highways. "You sure?" Frank chimed in, "Yes, ma'am, we're all right now. Just a gang that tried to shake us down." She exhaled, shaking her head. "Outlaws. There's too many of them. Good folks can't catch a break." She glanced at Emily again. "Glad you're okay. You, ex-military?" Emily gave a curt nod. "Yeah, Army nurse." A small smile of respect crossed the woman's face. "Marine Corps 2nd Division." "Semper Fi." The two women exchanged a handshake, a silent bond. Then the biker went to fuel her motorcycle while Emily and Frank retreated to the store's entrance, keeping watch. The tension slowly thawed. Emily realized that her presence, along with another veteran on the premises, made her feel more confident. Perhaps the outlaws wouldn't dare come back tonight. Still, a knot of unease lingered. She felt it too many times, a premonition that trouble was merely postponed. As the woman finished pumping her gas and rode off, Emily mulled over the possibility that the Devil's Mirage might be regrouping, possibly calling in reinforcements. Gangs like theirs thrived on intimidation. A single setback often fueled their desire for revenge. "Emily," Frank said quietly, "you've done more than enough for one day. If you need to move on, I understand." She looked at him. "I promised I'd stay until you're safe. But yes, I do need to get going eventually. I still think you should close early and maybe stay somewhere else tonight, at least until this blows over." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I hate leaving my station unprotected, but you're right. I can't fight a whole gang. I'll close up now, drive into town, and spend a night at my sister's place. The sheriff said he'd send someone by." "That's for the best," she agreed. They locked up together, turning off the neon open sign that buzzed in the front window. Frank double-checked the doors while Emily grabbed her belongings. She stepped outside, looking around the quiet parking lot. The wind carried a slight cooling breeze, rustling the sparse vegetation. As she approached her truck, she glanced at the horizon. The sky was now a blend of deep blue and fading orange, a final stand of daylight against oncoming night. She felt the usual post-adrenaline crash sinking in, fatigue, a hollow ache in her stomach, and that subtle tremor in her hands that always took a while to fade. Frank joined her. "I can't thank you enough. If you ever come through here again, you've got a friend." She accepted his handshake, noticing how his fingers still shook a bit. "Take care of yourself, Frank. And call me if something happens." She scribbled her phone number on a piece of paper, handing it to him. He seemed touched by the gesture. With that, Frank climbed into his own older model sedan, started the engine, and pulled onto the road, waving goodbye. Emily watched his taillights fade, swallowed by the dusk. She took a moment to breathe, letting the hush of the evening settle around her. She considered her next move. The plan had been to continue south to a small motel near the border, but after the day's events, she felt uncertain. She decided to drive for a bit, find a quiet spot, and let the tension dissipate before settling in for the night. The roads around here were mostly empty, the stars above brilliant in the clear sky. She started her truck, the engine rumbling comfortingly, and steered onto the dark highway. For a fleeting moment, she felt the old surge of freedom that came with driving at night, away from city lights. Yet a nagging thought pressed at her. The outlaws' final threats, the way they'd promised retaliation. She'd seen that look before, in eyes that believed violence was the only path. A pit formed in her stomach, a dread that the confrontation was far from over. Emily's headlights pierced the darkness as she drove away from Miller's fuel stop. In her rearview mirror, the station's silhouette shrank into obscurity. Somewhere on these lonely roads, however, the Devil's Mirage lurked, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a danger that might rear its head when she least expected it. Night had fallen in earnest by the time Emily reached a small roadside motel. The neon sign, flickering intermittently, read Riverbend lot vacancy. It wasn't much, just a row of rooms facing a dusty parking lot. A battered ice machine stood sentinel near the office door. Emily parked her truck, scanned the empty spaces, and saw only a couple of other vehicles. She felt an odd sense of relief that it wasn't crowded, fewer potential threats. Inside the office, she rang the bell on the front desk. A tired-looking clerk emerged from a back room. He was middle-aged, with thinning hair and a name tag that read Cal. Without much fuss, he checked her in, assigning her a room on the far end. Emily paid in cash, still keyed up enough from the day's events to prefer anonymity. "Any food around here?" she asked, voice subdued. Cal shrugged. "We've got a vending machine by the ice maker. Restaurant down the road closed an hour ago, but there's a diner about 5 miles east, open till midnight." She took her key and thanked him, deciding the vending machine would suffice for now. After stepping back outside, she grabbed a soda and some peanuts, then made her way to her room. A single bed, a small table, and a TV that looked older than she was. Plain, but functional. She locked the door behind her, dragged the wooden chair in front of it for added security, then double-checked the window latch. The events at Miller's fuel stop played through her mind like a film reel on repeat. Each time she recalled the confrontation, she'd catch another detail. The glint in the leader's eye, the specific angle of the younger biker's chain swing. She thought about how easily the situation could have turned deadly. She kicked off her boots, sank onto the bed, and flicked on the TV for background noise. The local news droned about a missing hiker and an upcoming county fair. No mention of the day's altercation. Not yet, anyway. That might come tomorrow if the sheriff decided to issue any warnings. She took a long sip of her soda, letting the carbonation tingle. Her mind drifted to a conversation she'd had with a fellow nurse during her 3rd deployment. He told her, "Combat changes you, sure. But if you keep your heart in the right place, you can still be the shield for others." She'd brushed off the sentimentality at the time, but now those words resonated. The next morning, Emily woke at dawn, the sky blushing with the first hints of light. Sleep had been restless, filled with vague nightmares of desert firefights mixed with leather-clad bikers. She rubbed her eyes, changed into fresh clothes, and stepped outside. A cool, dry breeze greeted her, carrying the scent of mesquite. The horizon glowed with pastels, a serene contrast to the tension she still felt. She briefly considered skipping town without heading to the sheriff's station. But that nagging sense of responsibility pushed her forward. The outlaws had threatened more than just Frank. If they roamed these highways unchecked, more people would become victims. Emily had no illusions of single-handedly shutting down an entire gang, but she could at least provide law enforcement with enough information to act. She paid for another soda in the vending machine, her makeshift breakfast, then started her truck. The engine coughed a bit, reminding her it was overdue for a tune-up, but roared to life nonetheless. Cal waved from the office window as she pulled out of the motel lot, and she gave a slight nod in return. Following the directions Frank had given her, she found a small sheriff's station in a nearby town, a modest building of tan brick with a single patrol car parked outside. She stepped inside to a stuffy reception area lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs. A deputy with a tidy uniform and a polite smile greeted her. "Morning, ma'am. Can I help you? I'm Emily Connor. The sheriff asked me to come by to give a statement." The deputy nodded. "Right, about the trouble at Miller's fuel stop. The sheriff's in his office. I'll let him know you're here." Emily took a seat on a plastic chair, scanning the bulletin board on the wall. It featured missing pets, community events, and a few wanted posters. One of them was for a member of a biker gang known to run drugs in the region, though the name on the poster wasn't the Devil's Mirage. She wondered how many such outfits carved out territories in these forgotten corners of the state. Soon, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s stepped into the waiting area. He wore a neatly pressed uniform with a star-shaped badge over his heart. His face was weathered, suggesting years of confronting tough situations under the Texas sun. "Miss Connor," he asked, extending a hand. "Sheriff Sam Wilcox." She stood and shook his hand, finding his grip firm but not overpowering. "Nice to meet you, Sheriff. Come on back to my office. We can chat in private." She followed him down a short hallway, passing an evidence room with glass windows displaying confiscated items, knives, guns, bags of food. His office was small but orderly, a wooden desk covered in files, a laptop, and a dusty old globe on a side table. He motioned for her to sit. "Thanks for coming in," he began, settling into his chair. "Frank told me quite the story about you disarming half a dozen of these Devil's Mirage fellas. Sounds like you've got some training." Emily offered a modest shrug. "Combat nurse. Learned enough to protect myself and others in a pinch." He nodded, scribbling a note on a pad. "I appreciate you stepping in. Not everyone would have the courage or skill to handle that." "I did what I had to," she replied, uncomfortable with praise. "Any leads on where the gang might be now?" The sheriff exhaled a long breath. "They've been sighted in a few counties. They're nomadic, making it tough for us to pin them down. We suspect they're running small-time rackets, shakedowns, intimidation, maybe some stolen goods. They haven't escalated to homicide, at least not recently, but that doesn't mean they're not dangerous." Emily's eyes flicked to a stack of photos on his desk. She saw images of motorcycles, possibly a group shot of the Devil's Mirage from a distance. "They said they'd be back." "Do you think they meant specifically at Miller's fuel stop, or just in general?" He tapped his pen on the table. "Hard to say. Bullies don't like losing face. If you inflicted a bruise on their pride, they might want payback. But they might also cut their losses given the risk. You humiliated them, and I'm sure they're not pleased." She shifted in her chair, recalling the leader's snarled threat. "Is Frank safe for now? We've been sending a patrol car by his station every couple of hours. Plus, Frank's got family in town, so he's spending nights there until things cool down." The sheriff steepled his fingers. "You mind giving me a full statement so we have a record if they retaliate?" Emily nodded. "Of course." They spent the next half hour going through the details. She recounted how she arrived at the station, the demands made by the bikers, and the ensuing confrontation. She provided descriptions as best as she could: heights, distinctive scars, approximate ages. Her memory, honed by training, allowed her to give more detail than most would. Sheriff Wilcox listened intently, occasionally interjecting with clarifying questions. When they finished, he placed the notepad aside. "That's helpful. We'll keep an eye out. In the meantime, you be careful. These folks might see you as a threat, and they've got a network of eyes on the road." Emily sighed, thinking of her wandering lifestyle. "Understood. I don't intend to stay in one place too long. I'm traveling." "Where to?" She hesitated, not wanting to reveal personal details. "So maybe." "No fixed plan." He studied her, seeming to sense her guardedness. "All right, but keep in mind, we can offer some measure of protection if you decide to stay local." She thanked him, but doubted she'd take him up on it. She'd never been one to lean on law enforcement for personal safety. In her experience, by the time authorities arrived, the damage was often done. She'd always relied on her own vigilance. As she left the sheriff's station, she noticed the day was already sweltering. The asphalt shimmered, and the dusty breeze offered little relief. She climbed into her truck and considered her next move. Part of her wanted to drop by Frank's station again, just to make sure everything was truly okay, but she also knew that might be inviting trouble. If the bikers spotted her, it could reignite conflict. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a number she didn't recognize. She answered cautiously. "Hello, Emily." Frank's voice crackled on the other end. "Sheriff Wilcox gave me your number. I just wanted to let you know, I'm all right. He said you stopped by the station." She smiled in relief. "Good to hear you're safe, Frank. Are you still at your sister's place?" "Yes, and I'll keep the station closed a couple more days. Maybe do some maintenance. Give the sheriff time to figure out if those thugs are still around." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Smart. Let me know if you need anything." He hesitated. "I will. Thank you." The call ended, leaving Emily feeling somewhat lighter. At least Frank was taking precautions. Yet an undercurrent of unease remained. What if the gang did come looking for her? She started the engine, deciding to continue south. If the Devil's Mirage wanted a confrontation, they'd likely keep to the highways they knew. She could slip away, keep a low profile, and perhaps the memory of her would fade. Still, as she guided her truck onto the open road, that old pang of duty tugged at her. She recalled the faces of the outlaws, especially the scarred leader. The seething anger in his eyes was not something easily forgotten. People like him often sank deeper into violence if no one stood up to them. The rumble of her truck's engine filled the cab as Emily accelerated onto the highway. In the rearview mirror, she watched the sheriff's station shrink into the heat haze. Even as the horizon beckoned with the promise of new places, she couldn't shake the gnawing sense that the storm with Devil's Mirage was only gathering force and might just collide with her path again. For the next 2 days, Emily drove aimlessly across the Texas backroads, making her way towards smaller towns and winding highways. She kept an eye out for any sign of the Devil's Mirage, but saw nothing beyond the usual smattering of travelers and the occasional lone biker. At night, she'd stay in budget motels or sleep in her truck under starlit skies, always careful to park in well-lit, somewhat populated areas. During one late afternoon, she pulled into a nearly empty diner near the outskirts of a dusty town called Bramble Creek. Faded letters on the window boasted Best Pie in Texas, and a neon-open sign flickered in the doorway. She sat at the counter, ordered a grilled cheese sandwich and a slice of peach pie, and tried to relax. The diner had the same small-town vibe she'd come to expect. Friendly waitress, a cook humming a country tune in the kitchen, a few worn-looking locals nursing cups of coffee. Emily found a measure of comfort in the routine. She was just another traveler passing through. Nobody gave her a second glance, aside from a polite nod or smile. Halfway through her meal, her phone buzzed again. She checked the screen, expecting maybe a call from Frank or the sheriff. Instead, the caller ID was blocked. She felt a prick of unease. She answered with caution. "Hello." Silence. Then a breath. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Emily's stomach dropped. She recognized the voice, the scarred leader of the Devil's Mirage. She didn't speak immediately, letting him continue. "You're not so tough without that tire iron in your hand," he sneered. "I told you this wasn't over. Maybe you thought you could just ride off into the sunset." Her mind raced. How did he get her number? She'd only given it to Frank and the sheriff. There was a chance they found her through less direct means, maybe hacking or intimidation. Gangs had networks, sometimes more sophisticated than outsiders realized. "What do you want?" she said, keeping her voice steady, mindful of the other diner patrons. The outlaw chuckled. "You're gonna find out soon enough. We got friends everywhere, darling. You can run, but you can't hide." She felt the old surge of adrenaline, but kept her composure. "I'm not running. If you want to fight, you'll regret coming after me." He let out a harsh laugh. "Talk tough all you want. We'll see if your nurse skills can save your hide next time." Then the line went dead. Emily lowered the phone, her heart pounding. She inhaled deeply, trying to steady the tremor in her hand. Carefully, she slipped the device back into her pocket, her appetite evaporating. She glanced around the diner, half expecting to see a suspicious face in the corner. But the patrons seemed harmless, engrossed in their own lives. She tossed some bills on the counter and slid off the stool, leaving her half-eaten sandwich and pie behind. The waitress, perplexed, called out, "Everything okay, hon?" Emily just nodded curtly and stepped outside. The late afternoon sun hit her face, intensifying the tension pounding in her head. She paced her truck, scanning the parking lot. A single pickup with local plates, a battered sedan, and a dusty compact car were the only vehicles. No bikes. Yet the phone call implied the outlaws were tracking her somehow. She needed to move, and fast. Once inside her truck, she locked the doors, started the engine, and pulled onto the highway. She considered driving straight to the sheriff's station again, but that might lead the outlaws right to it. Instead, she opted for a more indirect route, weaving through back roads to see if anyone was following. The phone call had rattled her deeply, not because she feared the gang's threats, but because she couldn't be sure who they had in their pocket. As evening approached, she found herself on a nearly deserted road slicing through open land. The landscape was barren, only the silhouettes of distant hills and occasional ranch fences to break the monotony. She exhaled a shaky breath, cursing under it. Part of her wanted to confront the gang head-on, but that might cause more harm than good. She was just one person, and while she had training, the Devil's Mirage had numbers and cunning. Night fell. The road remained empty aside from the scattered headlights, passing in the opposite direction. Emily considered turning off at the next motel, but decided to push further, wanting to put more distance between herself and any possible pursuit. She couldn't outrun them indefinitely, though. At some point, a confrontation might be unavoidable. Around 10 o'clock, she spotted a sign for a small roadside campground. The idea of parking among RVs and campers, possibly with families around, made her feel marginally safer. Witnesses were a deterrent. She took the exit, following a bumpy dirt road until she reached a clearing near a shallow river, where a dozen or so RVs and tents were scattered under moonlight. She found a secluded spot at the edge, parked her truck, and cut the engine. After scanning the area, she stepped out, stretching her stiff muscles. A few nearby campers were chatting around a fire, their laughter a distant murmur. She decided to slip into the back of her truck, where she'd rigged a sleeping arrangement that was Spartan but functional, an old foam mattress roll and a sleeping bag. She'd done this many times on her cross-country ventures. Lying there, gazing up at the star-studded sky, she tried to center herself. The phone call replayed in her mind. "We got friends everywhere. You can run, but you can't hide." She closed her eyes, recalling the calm approach she had learned as a combat nurse, slow breathing, steadying the heart rate, controlling the fear that threatened to take root. Hours later, she drifted into a restless sleep. She dreamt of desert battlefields, of dusty gas stations, and of menacing silhouettes that wore the Devil's Mirage patch. In her dream, she fought them off again, each strike echoing with the screams of wounded soldiers she had once tended. The noise built to a crescendo until she jerked awake, heart pounding, the night air still and silent. Dawn's light tinted the horizon pale blue. Emily rubbed her eyes and sat up. The campsite seemed peaceful, birds chirping, a faint breeze stirring the river reeds. She swung her feet out of the truck, her boots crunching on gravel. A few other campers were already stirring, sipping coffee from thermoses. She nodded hello to one elderly couple who greeted her with a smile. She decided to freshen up at the campground's small restroom facility. As she approached, her phone buzzed again. Her stomach tightened. Another blocked call. She declined to answer this time, letting it go to voicemail. She didn't need a fresh round of threats first thing in the morning. Inside the restroom, she splashed water on her face and studied her reflection in the tarnished mirror. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She hadn't slept well in days. She forced a few steadying breaths, then returned to her truck. Her phone showed a new voicemail alert. She pressed play, bracing herself. A different voice this time, maybe one of the other gang members. "Hey there, nurse. You ignoring us? Not a good idea. We'll see you real soon. Boss is mighty eager." Emily swallowed, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. Clearly, the gang wanted her to stay on edge, to keep her looking over her shoulder. They thrived on psychological intimidation. In the field, she'd learned that fear could be more crippling than an actual bullet. She refused to be paralyzed by it, but anxiety still gnawed at her. She needed a plan. Hiding forever wasn't an option, nor was leading them on a wild chase across Texas. She could approach the sheriff again, but small-town law enforcement might not be enough to dismantle an entire gang. Another possibility was to contact higher authorities, state troopers, or the Texas Rangers, but that might take time and coordination. Starting the truck, she decided to head back toward a more populated area. Wandering these empty roads with a gang, possibly tracking her, was foolish. She had to be somewhere that offered resources and allies. Maybe near the city, she could find a safe haven or even connect with other veterans groups for backup. As she merged onto a larger highway, her mind churned with potential strategies. She envisioned worst-case scenarios, the outlaws cornering her in a parking lot, or them ambushing her at a red light. She'd faced ambushes before, but never alone. A pang of longing surfaced. She missed the camaraderie of her unit, where at least you had battle buddies watching your six. Midway through the morning, Emily's phone rang again. This time, it was Sheriff Wilcox's number. She answered, trying to sound calm. "Sheriff, Emily, got some news. We got a tip that the Devil's Mirage might be heading toward the border. Some locals saw a group of bikers matching their description on Highway 45. They mentioned something about finishing business with that nurse." She tightened her grip on the wheel. "So they're actively looking for me." "Seems like it," Wilcox confirmed grimly. "I don't have full jurisdiction out there, but I can't coordinate with the local departments." "Where are you now?" She gave a rough description of her location, near the junction of two highways. The sheriff let out a low whistle. "That's not too far from the route we suspect they're taking. Do you have a place to go? Someone who can vouch for you or offer protection?" She thought of the few friends she had scattered around the state. None in this area. "Not really. I'm on my own." He cursed under his breath. "All right. Here's my advice. Get to a bigger city, San Antonio maybe. I'll try to contact the PD there. Let them know the situation. Keep me posted on your whereabouts. Let's not make it easy for them." Emily nodded, her heart thumping. "Okay, Sheriff. I'll move towards San Antonio. Be careful," he warned. "And don't try to take on a whole gang by yourself." After hanging up, Emily changed course, heading southwest toward the city. The wind whistled through the partially open window, tousling her hair. Her mind flickered with scenarios. She could lose the gang in a dense urban environment, or they might track her anyway. Either way, she was done playing cat and mouse on deserted highways. Clouds gathered in the distance, as if mirroring her brewing conflict. Emily pushed the accelerator, determined to reach safety or, at the very least, a more defensible position. Yet, with the Devil's Mirage closing in and the road stretching out endlessly before her, she couldn't help but wonder, will the next confrontation leave her any room to walk away unscathed? San Antonio greeted Emily with sprawling highways, tall buildings, and a surge of traffic that felt both overwhelming and oddly reassuring. She navigated the city streets, scanning the rearview mirror for any sign of trailing motorcycles. So far, nothing. Yet tension coiled in her gut. The Devil's Mirage had made it clear they would track her. Big city or not, they had ways. She found a chain motel on the outskirts, better security, cameras in the parking lot, busy street out front. She parked and headed inside, paying for a room. The clerk, a young woman with bright pink nails, handed her a key card. Emily's gaze flicked to the lobby windows, her nerves still on alert, but everything seemed normal. In her room, she dropped onto the bed, feeling the weight of exhaustion. She flicked on the TV for noise, scanning local news channels for any mention of biker gangs. Nothing. Perhaps the outlaws were lying low. She considered calling the sheriff to update him, but decided to wait. The afternoon dragged on. Hunger finally drove her out. A restaurant across the street served Tex-Mex, so she ventured over, trying to blend in with the lunch crowd. She felt hypervigilant, scanning the faces of patrons for any sign of threat, jumping at the sound of a motorcycle engine passing by on the road outside. Later, back in her motel room, she found herself pacing. The hours were long, her mind restless. She flipped through channels on the TV, read a few articles on her phone, and even tried to nap, but the anxiety wouldn't let her rest. All the while, her phone remained silent. No new calls from blocked numbers, no news from the sheriff. By dusk, The city lights began winking on, illuminating the streets in neon. Emily decided to call Wilcox. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. She left a concise message updating him on her location and asking if there was any news on the Devil's Mirage. Minutes later, her phone buzzed. Hope flared. It might be the sheriff. But the screen read unknown. She tensed, picking it up reluctantly. Emily Connor, the scarred leader's voice drawled. Her blood went cold. She remained silent, letting him talk. San Antonio, huh? Big place. Plenty of places for you to hide. She forced her voice to stay steady. How did you get my number? How do you know where I am? He laughed, a cruel sound. We've got friends, like I said. People who owe us favors. Watch the roads. Look for your truck. You're not as invisible as you think. Her heartbeat thundered. So the gang had local informants, or at least people they'd intimidated into sharing info. What do you want from me? I told you, payback. You embarrassed us back at that gas station. He paused, as if savoring the moment. We ain't gonna let a nurse make fools of us. I won't let you hurt innocent people, she said, voice low. So noble, he mocked. We'll see how noble you are when we catch up to you. Then the line went dead. Emily closed her eyes, adrenaline surging. She needed to stay on the move or risk being cornered. But where to go in this vast city? She weighed her options: keep driving at night, check in with the local police, or rendezvous with Sheriff Wilcox if he arrived. She felt cornered, uncertain which move was right. Unable to remain idle, she grabbed her backpack and left the motel room. The parking lot, illuminated by overhead lamps, felt claustrophobic. She got into her truck, scanning the area. A few cars, no obvious bikes. She started the engine and pulled onto the road, deciding to head downtown where crowds might provide anonymity. As she drove, the city's lights formed a kaleidoscope of neon signs, street lamps, and headlights. Tourist areas bustle with life even at night. Restaurants, music venues, people strolling the sidewalks. She found a public garage near a busy street and parked. Exiting on foot, she wove through throngs of people, mindful of every motorcycle rumble echoing in the distance. The Riverwalk area glittered with reflections from the water. Tour boats drifted lazily, filled with camera-wielding sightseers. Normally, Emily would find this place charming, a tranquil urban oasis. But now she was too on edge to appreciate the scenery. She spotted several bikers here and there, but none wore the Devil's Mirage patch. Still, she couldn't relax. Eventually, she ducked into a small bar off the main tourist path, hoping the crowd inside would keep her safe. The interior was dim, with blues music playing softly. She found a corner table and ordered a soda, not wanting to dull her senses with alcohol. She sat back to the wall, scanning the faces in the room. People chatted, laughed, and clinked glasses, oblivious to the storm swirling in her mind. Emily listened to the band's guitar riffs, letting the music calm her racing thoughts. For a moment, she almost felt normal, just another city patron unwinding after a long day. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself. But the reprieve was short-lived. The door swung open, and in walked two men wearing leather jackets. One had a shaved head, the other a messy ponytail. Both scanned a bar with predatory gazes. Emily stiffened, carefully sliding her chair into the shadowed corner. She caught a glimpse of their patches, Devil's Mirage. Her heart hammered. They hadn't spotted her yet, but it was only a matter of time. She quickly looked around for an exit. The bar's main door was now behind the bikers. A hallway to the left might lead to restrooms or a back exit. She prayed for a second door. The men took a few steps in, scanning. One elbowed the other, gesturing to the bar patrons. Emily kept her head low, sipping her soda, arms tense. If she tried to slip away now, she might draw their attention. If they spotted her, a fight would break out among innocent bystanders. She waited, heart in her throat, as they moved deeper into the bar. Another wave of patrons came in behind them, temporarily blocking their view. Seeing her chance, Emily stood, careful to blend into the crowd, and moved swiftly toward the hallway. Once in the narrow corridor, she found a door labeled Exit. Relieved, she pushed it open. She stumbled into an alleyway filled with dumpsters and the stench of stale beer. She carefully eased the door shut, muffling the bar's noise. The alley was deserted except for a sleeping homeless man near a stack of boxes. She exhaled, trying to calm her racing pulse. She needed to get back to her truck without drawing attention. The alley led to a side street, where neon from a nearby nightclub cast flickering patterns on the pavement. She walked briskly, hoping she could navigate around a few blocks and double back to the parking garage without crossing paths with the outlaws. Minutes later, she emerged onto a bustling main street. Car horns blared, and groups of friends laughed boisterously as they moved between clubs. Emily blended into the sea of people, weaving through the throng. Every time she heard the roar of a motorcycle, her stomach lurched, but none of them bore the devil's Mirage patch. Eventually, she reached the parking garage. The neon sign overhead hummed quietly. She climbed the concrete ramps, each level revealing rows of parked cars. Her truck was on the third level. She approached cautiously, scanning for any watchers, but saw no one suspicious. She slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and exhaled, relief mixing with dread. She was still a target, and now she knew the gang had men in the city looking for her. If they found her truck, they'd stake it out. She couldn't stay in one place for long. The engine roared to life, and Emily gripped the steering wheel, her hands trembling from lingering adrenaline. Somewhere in San Antonio's vast sprawl, the devil's Mirage lurked, hunting her. With every passing minute, the noose tightened. Yet Emily refused to break. She had a plan forming, even if it meant confronting them on her own terms before they could strike first. Emily drove through the night, navigating the city's labyrinth of streets. She decided running was no longer an option. The outlaws would keep pursuing her unless she did something to end it. Her mind replayed every tactic she'd learned in combat about ambushes and strategic advantage. They were searching for her, and that was her greatest edge. She knew they were coming. Dawn found her parked in the lot of a big box store near the edge of the city. She dozed off in the driver's seat for maybe an hour, exhaustion overpowering her even as her mind screamed danger. Rubbing her neck, she looked around. Early morning light bathed the asphalt in a pale wash. She needed a more controlled environment if she was going to confront the devil's Mirage. Her thoughts turned to an abandoned construction site she'd passed the previous day, an industrial park at the outskirts of town, mostly deserted. If she lured them there, she could control the terrain. She wasn't proud of wanting a final showdown, but she saw no alternative. Let them come, but on her terms. She called Sheriff Wilcox. This time he answered on the third ring. "Emily, where are you?" She gave him the broad strokes. "They found me in the city, or at least some of them did. I need to end this." The sheriff's tone sharpened. "End this how? You're not going vigilante, are you?" Emily rubbed her temple, exhaustion gnawing at her. "I'm not trying to get killed, but they won't stop unless someone forces them to. I'm telling you where I'll be, so you can intervene if things go south." He hesitated. "All right, talk to me." She described the abandoned industrial area, the rough location, some warehouses near an old rail line. "It's far enough from civilians," she explained. "I'll lure them there. If you can get some units there quietly, maybe we can catch them in the act." The sheriff let out a long sigh. "You realize this is extremely dangerous? They're armed, and they'll come in numbers." "I understand," she said simply. "But I can't keep running." "Okay, I'll do what I can. But my resources are limited, and this is outside my usual jurisdiction. I'll contact the local PD. Don't do anything until we're set up." She agreed, but she knew time was of the essence. The gang wouldn't wait around politely for law enforcement to organize. She needed a surefire way to get them to the industrial park. Another idea surfaced. Call them. She had a record of the blocked call, but she couldn't call back that number. However, maybe she could provoke them into meeting her by leaving a message somewhere they'd find it. She decided to send a text to Frank, instructing him to pass a simple message if the gang called him again. She suspected they might try. It read, "Tell them the nurse is done hiding. Meet me at the old rail yard off Highline Road at sundown." She felt uneasy dragging Frank into this further, but she trusted he'd relay the message if forced. She told him to call her immediately if they threatened him. As the day wore on, Emily readied herself. She grabbed supplies from the big box store, a sturdy flashlight, some rope, a small crowbar, and a few miscellaneous items that could be used as improvised defenses. She also purchased a burner phone to avoid them tracking her personal number. Once she was done, she scouted the industrial park in broad daylight, mentally mapping vantage points, potential cover, and exit routes. By late afternoon, Sheriff Wilcox texted, "Local PD is short-staffed, but they'll send a couple of unmarked cars. They can't promise more." Emily acknowledged, feeling a mix of relief and trepidation. She parked her truck behind an abandoned warehouse, setting the stage for her plan. Dusk settled, painting the sky in burnt oranges and purples. Emily crouched behind a rusted shipping container, glancing at her phone. Minutes ticked by. Her pulse thrummed in her ears. A gentle breeze carried the smells of dust and old machinery. She recalled her time in Iraq, the anticipation before an impending threat, the hush that descended right before chaos erupted. At first, nothing. The industrial park remained silent, empty except for scurrying rodents and the occasional groan of old metal structures. She wondered if the gang hadn't received her challenge, or if they dismissed it as a trap. She texted Wilcox again, no sign yet. Then, faintly at first, she heard the rumble of motorcycles. The hair on her arms stood on end. She peered around a corner, seeing headlights bouncing across broken pavement. Multiple bikes. At least 5, maybe 6. She clenched her jaw, adrenaline spiking. This was it. The motorcycles formed a rough line, engines revving menacingly as they entered the yard. Emily spotted the scarred leader at the front. Behind him, the younger biker with the chain, the bearded one, and a couple of others she recognized from Miller's fuel stop. One more figure trailed them, perhaps a new addition or someone she hadn't noticed before. They killed their engines, the sudden silence jarring. The leader swung off his bike, scanning the shadows. "You sure this is the place?" he growled to his men. One pointed to the truck, partially visible behind a warehouse wall. "That's her ride, boss." He nodded, unsheathing a knife, the same switchblade she'd seen before. They fanned out, searching. Emily crouched lower, her heartbeat thunderous. She glanced around, expecting any moment to see the cavalry, Wilcox's unmarked cars. But the area looked deserted aside from the gang. Carefully, Emily moved behind another shipping container, inching closer to the group. She recognized that taking them head-on was suicide. She needed to isolate them. She also hoped to buy time for the police to arrive. She considered drawing them into a cat-and-mouse game amid the warehouses. The bearded biker grumbled, "Where is she?" He kicked a piece of debris in frustration. "Maybe it's a trap," said the younger one with the chain, his voice tinged with unease. "Wouldn't be the first time," the leader sneered. "Keep your eyes open." He raised his voice. "Hey, nurse. Come out, wherever you are." His tone dripped with menace. Emily tensed, gripping a metal rod she'd found earlier. She needed to make a move or risk them splitting up too much. She banged the rod against a metal container, the clang echoing. The bikers spun toward the sound. There, the younger one barked, chain ready in his hand. As they converged on the container, Emily slipped around to flank them. She tossed a stone toward another stack of metal scraps, drawing their attention yet again. The group splintered. The leader and 2 bikers approached the first container. The younger one and bearded one headed to the scraps. She seized the opportunity. Darting from her cover, She slammed the metal rod against the back of the bearded biker's knee. He collapsed with a yell. The younger one spun, swinging his chain wildly. Emily ducked, rolling behind a pile of debris for cover. The chain whipped the air, narrowly missing her. "Boss, she's here," the younger biker shouted. Their voices reverberated off the walls. Emily heard footsteps pounding closer. She scuttled backward, pressing against a stack of pallets. The bearded biker clutched his knee, cursing loudly. The younger one advanced, chain at the ready. "Don't be shy now," he hissed, scanning the shadows. With a swift motion, he lashed the chain at the pallets. Emily rolled aside just in time, splinters flying. From the corner of her eye, she saw the leader rushing in, knife glinting under the dim lights. Another biker flanked him, brandishing a metal pipe. She was outnumbered, pinned down. Fear clawed at her, but she forced herself to focus. Where was law enforcement? She'd pinned her hopes on them arriving by now. She scanned the area for an escape route, spotting a narrow alley between two warehouses. If she could lead them there, the limited space might give her an advantage. She sprinted, weaving around the fallen bearded man who tried to grab her ankle. The younger biker and the leader gave chase, while the others fanned out to block potential exits. Emily darted into the alley. It was littered with garbage and rusted barrels. She counted footsteps, 2 behind her, maybe one coming around from the opposite end. She needed a plan fast. She spotted a rusted ladder leading to a catwalk above. Without hesitation, she leapt onto it, climbing as quickly as she could. The metal rungs groaned under her weight. Below, the younger bikers saw her move. "She's going up," he hollered. From the catwalk, Emily had a vantage point. She looked down, seeing the scarred leader and the chain-wielding biker at the base of the ladder. The leader glared up, face twisted with hatred. He tried the ladder, but it wobbled dangerously. Instead, he barked orders to his men to find another way up. Panic thrummed in Emily's veins. This catwalk was old and might not support multiple people. She inched along, searching for an exit or a stable vantage. The overhead lights flickered, revealing a partial walkway that led around the warehouse's perimeter. She could see a potential drop-off near the far corner. A risky jump, but maybe better than being trapped. Suddenly, the younger biker hurled his chain upward, trying to snag her leg. She yanked her foot away just in time, the chain clanging against the metal grating. A cold sweat broke out across her brow. She needed to keep moving. She heard the sound of multiple footsteps echoing from below. With each second, the gang closed in. She decided on the jump, steeling herself. She sprinted the length of the catwalk, ignoring the tremors of unstable metal beneath her feet. At the corner, she peered over the edge. Below was a stack of crates about 8 feet down. If she landed properly, she could absorb the impact without breaking anything. Exhaling sharply, she jumped, landing on the crates with a jarring thud. Pain shot through her right ankle, but she remained upright. She scrambled down another few feet to the ground. Behind her, the bikers cursed, trying to figure out her route. Panting, Emily limped through the warehouse's half-open entrance. Inside was a cavernous space littered with old machinery, forklift pallets, and shards of broken glass. She pressed a hand to her throbbing ankle, cursing under her breath. She twisted it on landing, but it was still functional. Footsteps approached again. She lurked behind a metal press, scanning for anything usable. She found a length of pipe, gripping it in sweaty palms. The warehouse lights were mostly dead, only stray shafts of moonlight filtering through high windows. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, seeing a message from Wilcox, en route. Hang on. Relief and dread mingled. She just had to survive until backup arrived. But how long would that take? Cliffhanger, the echo of boots scraping concrete grew louder. Emily gritted her teeth, pipe in hand, heart pounding. She was cornered, injured, and outnumbered. The next seconds would decide everything. Could she hold them off long enough for help to arrive, Or would this be the final devastating clash with the devil's Mirage? Emily pressed herself against the metal press, breaths coming in short, sharp gulps. The ache in her ankle pulsed with every heartbeat. She clutched the pipe in both hands, scanning the gloom for movement. Every nerve in her body felt alive with tension. A figure slid through a gap in the machinery, stepping into a moonlit patch on the floor. It was the scarred leader, knife in hand, his gaze sweeping the area. Another figure followed, the younger biker with the chain. Emily's grip tightened on the pipe. The leader's voice sliced through the darkness. "It's over, nurse. You got nowhere to run." He paced slowly, each step echoing, glancing from shadow to shadow. The younger biker tossed his chain in a lazy circle, creating a rhythmic swish. "Why don't you come out and make this easy on yourself?" Emily's pulse hammered. Any second now, the rest of the gang might appear, boxing her incompletely. She dared not wait. If she didn't strike first, they'd overwhelm her. Summoning her courage, she took 3 rapid steps forward and swung the pipe at the younger biker's chain arm. He barely managed to block, raising his forearm. The impact rang out, metal on flesh. He howled, dropping the chain. She followed with a jab aimed at his midsection. He staggered back, cursing. The leader lunged, knife glinting. She pivoted, but her ankle buckled, causing her to fall sideways. He seized the moment, slashing downward. She managed to raise the pipe, deflecting the blade, but the force knocked her off balance. Pain seared her ankle as she scrambled back, the pipe slipping from her grip. The younger biker, teeth bared in fury, moved in to grab her. She lashed out with a swift kick to his shin, causing him to stumble. But the leader grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back and pressed the knife to her throat. Emily froze, pulse racing dangerously. One wrong move, and he could open her jugular. "This is the end of the line," he hissed, breath hot against her ear. She felt a surge of defiance, refusing to show fear. "Do what you're gonna do," she spat. A twisted smirk crossed his face. "Oh, I intend to." He tightened his grip, the knife's edge digging into her skin just enough to draw a bead of blood. Suddenly, the distant wail of sirens pierced the warehouse's dusty hush. The leader's eyes flicked upward, startled. The younger biker's head snapped toward the entrance. Emily seized that distraction, slamming her elbow into the leader's ribcage with all her might. He gasped, his hold loosening, allowing her to twist away from the blade. She dropped to the floor, ignoring the pain in her ankle, and crawled behind a broken pallet. The younger biker lunged for her, but the cacophony of sirens grew louder, accompanied by the distant screech of tires. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the cracked windows. The leader cursed. "Cops. How the hell?" Outside, engines roared as law enforcement vehicles careened into the industrial yard. Emily heard doors slamming, authoritative voices shouting orders. The devil's Mirage had seconds to decide, run or fight. "Back exit," the leader barked. He lunged toward Emily, but the younger biker pulled him away, frantically scanning for a path to escape. They ran deeper into the warehouse, presumably seeking another door. Emily used the reprieve to scramble to her feet, pipe in hand. She hobbled toward the entrance, the swirl of lights growing brighter. She nearly collapsed from relief when she saw uniformed officers charging inside with flashlights and weapons drawn. One of them shouted at her, "Hands up." She complied instantly, dropping the pipe and raising her arms. The second officer rushed forward, recognized she was the victim, and lowered his weapon. "You, Emily Connor?" She nodded breathlessly, collapsing against a piece of machinery. "They went that way," she panted, pointing. "Leader's got a knife. Younger one's got a chain." The officers nodded, pressing deeper into the warehouse. Emily sank to the floor, adrenaline fading. Her ankle throbbed, her throat stung where the knife had cut her, and her lungs heaved with exertion. She felt tears welling but blinked them away, determined to stay composed. A few moments later, she heard shouts and cursing echo through the cavernous space. Several gunshots reverberated, causing her heart to leap. Then silence. Footsteps approached, followed by more shouting. After what felt like an eternity, the officers re-emerged, half walking, half dragging the scarred leader in handcuffs. Blood trickled down his temple, rage twisting his features. Another pair of officers escorted the younger biker, face contorted in pain as he clutched a wounded arm. Found him trying to escape through a loading door, an officer explained. They resisted arrest. One of them pulled a gun. Shots were fired. We got them pinned. The rest of their buddies scattered when they heard us coming, but we'll track them down. Relief crashed over Emily in a wave. It was over. The two main instigators, at least, were in custody. A female officer knelt beside her, checking her injuries. You're bleeding, she said gently, noting the cut on Emily's neck. I'm all right, Emily managed, though tears now threatened to spill. Sheriff Wilcox appeared, breathing heavily, sweat staining his uniform. He'd come personally, it seemed, to see this through. Emily, he exclaimed, helping her stand. You crazy fool. You could have gotten yourself killed. She swallowed hard, voice tight. Had no other choice. They would have kept chasing me, or someone else. He shook his head, but respect shone in his eyes. We'll make sure these scumbags don't see daylight for a long time. Medical personnel arrived shortly, checking Emily's vitals and cleaning the shallow knife wound on her throat. They taped her ankle, advising her to see a doctor for x-rays, though Emily's professional opinion was that it was a severe sprain at worst. The sun had fully risen outside, casting rays across the battered warehouse floor. As she hobbled out, leaning on a paramedic, she passed the scarred leader, now seated on the ground, hands cuffed behind his back. He glared at her, a snarl twisting his lips. But she no longer felt fear, only a profound weariness. Officers bustled around, collecting evidence, snapping photos, and organizing a search for the other bikers. Wilcox guided Emily to a waiting ambulance. You sure you're okay? He asked softly. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Just need to breathe. He patted her shoulder. We'll get your statement again. Then you can rest. You did good, Emily. Reckless, but good. She managed a faint smile. Thanks, Sheriff. In the aftermath, Emily cooperated with the investigators, describing the final showdown in detail. News vans eventually arrived, filming the scene. She found herself suddenly labeled a hero, though she felt more relieved than proud. With the gang's leaders in custody, the Devil's Mirage threat would diminish, or so she hoped. Some members were still at large, but their power had been broken. Frank called her later that day, voice trembling with relief. Emily, I heard what happened on the news. Are you all right? I'm fine, she reassured him, speaking from a hospital bed where her ankle was being evaluated. It's over, Frank. I'm so grateful, he said, choking up. Thank you. 3 days later, Emily stepped out of the hospital with a brace on her ankle, a small bandage on her neck. She had multiple interviews with local authorities and a brief conversation with a reporter from the local paper. Word spread quickly about the combat nurse who took down a biker gang at an abandoned warehouse. She deflected most of the attention, eager to return to anonymity. Sheriff Wilcox gave her a ride back to her repaired truck. It had been towed from the industrial park as evidence, but now it was free to go. They walked side by side through the station's parking lot. So what's next for you? He asked, handing her the keys. She leaned on a crutch, still favoring her ankle. Probably keep moving, at least for a little while. Then maybe go back to the VA hospital, see if they still need me. He nodded, leaning against her truck's door. You know, if you ever want to settle here, we could use someone like you. The county hospital always needs good nurses. She smiled gently. Maybe someday. But for now, I need time to clear my head. He understood. They shook hands, and she slipped into the driver's seat, gingerly adjusting her brace. The engine turned over, a comforting rumble in her chest. Sheriff Wilcox stepped back, watching her pull out of the lot. Emily drove slowly, feeling every bump in her sore ankle. She passed through the city limits, the sprawling suburbs giving way to open highways. The sun dipped low, bathing the sky in rich gold. On a whim, she took a detour toward Miller's fuel stop, wanting closure. When she arrived, she found Frank unlocking the door for the morning's business. He beamed when he saw her. They embraced briefly, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Everything's peaceful now," he said. "Sheriff's deputies still swing by, but I've had no trouble." She nodded, looking around the familiar pumps, the cracked pavement. Her chest tightened with emotion. "Good. I'm glad." He took a deep breath. "Well, you'll always be welcome here, Emily. You saved my life." She nodded, cheeks flushing. "Thanks, Frank." With that, she filled her tank one last time. The heat of the Texas sun was gentler in the early morning, casting long shadows across the station. She wiped sweat from her brow, feeling an odd sense of finality. As she got ready to leave, Frank called out, "Take care of yourself, Emily. Don't be a stranger." She waved through the open window, then eased her truck onto the highway. The horizon stretched out, limitless. She felt the winds of change rustling through her mind, a sense that she'd been tested and emerged, if not unscathed, then stronger in spirit. In her rearview mirror, the gas station shrank into the distance. She recalled the day she'd first arrived there, a quiet traveler just looking to fill her tank. Now she left as someone with a new chapter of her own story, one of standing up against bullies, of refusing to let fear dominate her or those around her. Would the Devil's Mirage regroup elsewhere? Possibly. But for now, their leadership was in jail, and Emily was free to continue her journey. Her phone lay silent on the passenger seat. No more calls from blocked numbers, no more threats lurking at the edge of reception. She'd wrested back control of her life, determined to face whatever came next with the same resolve that had guided her through 3 tours overseas. A calm spread through her as she pressed the accelerator, wind tousling her hair through the open window. The road ahead was vast and uncertain, but she welcomed it. She had survived war. She had survived the Devil's Mirage, and she knew, deep in her heart, that she would face any new challenge with the quiet, fierce courage that defined her. Months later, a small plaque appeared on Miller's fuel stop's wall, engraved with the words, "In honor of Emily Connor, combat nurse, protector, and friend." Locals spoke of the day she stood firm against a gang of outlaws, using her skills and wits to defend the innocent. The story became a local legend, a testament that sometimes true strength lies not in aggression, but in resolve, compassion, and the unyielding spirit to do what's right.